Is high LDL actually dangerous, or has the medical establishment overstated its importance, perhaps influenced by pharmaceutical interests, and created a cholesterol myth that has driven unnecessary medication in millions of people? This is one of the most debated questions in preventive medicine right now, and I want to address it honestly, laying out both sides of the evidence as fairly as I can, explaining what is strong, what is weak, and where I ultimately stand. My name is Dr. Victor Hayes. I have no financial relationship with any pharmaceutical company. Nobody is paying me to take any particular position. My only interest is in what the evidence actually shows, because what is at stake is how long people live and whether they die from preventable heart attacks. Let me start by clarifying what we are actually talking about, because a great deal of the confusion comes from imprecise language. LDL cholesterol is the amount of cholesterol being carried inside lipid particles in your bloodstream. These particles have a protein on their surface called apolipoprotein B, ApoB for short. Each ApoB containing particle carries exactly one ApoB molecule. This means that measuring ApoB gives you a direct count of how many atherogenic particles are circulating in your blood. This distinction matters because when it comes to forming plaques in arterial walls, it is the number of particles that drives the biology, not precisely how much cholesterol each particle carries. Two people with identical LDL cholesterol can have very different particle counts and very different cardiovascular risk profiles. This is why many researchers and clinicians now prefer measuring ApoB directly. With that established, what would it take to demonstrate that LDL and ApoB are genuinely causing heart disease, not merely associated with it? You would want to see a plausible biological mechanism. You would want higher levels to track with more disease across populations. You would want to see that reducing those levels reduces cardiovascular events. You would want genetic evidence showing that people born with naturally lower levels have lower lifetime cardiovascular risk. And ideally, you would want to see that effect scale proportionally with the degree of reduction, a dose-response relationship. Let me go through the evidence for each. On biological mechanism, LDL particles enter arterial walls, particularly at sites of endothelial damage. They become oxidized, trigger an immune response, attract macrophages, which turn into foam cells and form the early plaques of atherosclerosis. This pathway is extensively characterized in laboratory, animal, and human studies. The mechanism is well established and biologically coherent. On population tracking, higher LDL and ApoB levels consistently track with more cardiovascular events across diverse populations worldwide, though with meaningful variation based on other risk factors. On randomized trials, the Cholesterol Treatment Trialists Collaboration, a mega-analysis involving over 170,000 participants across multiple statin trials, found that every 1 mmol reduction in LDL cholesterol corresponds to approximately a 22% reduction in major cardiovascular events. This effect appears across primary prevention, secondary prevention, men, women, diabetic, and non-diabetic populations. More compelling still, PCSK9 inhibitors, a completely different drug class from statins, working through a different mechanism, produced the same result in large randomized trials. Evolocumab reduced cardiovascular events significantly when added to statin therapy. Alirocumab showed the same pattern. A third drug class, ezetimibe, blocking cholesterol absorption in the gut, also reduced events when added to statins. 3 different mechanisms. 3 different pharmaceutical companies. The same dose-response relationship between LDL lowering and cardiovascular event reduction each time. On genetic evidence, and this is perhaps the most powerful pillar of all, Mendelian randomization studies exploit the fact that your genes are randomly assigned at conception, functioning as a lifelong natural experiment. People who inherit gene variants that naturally lower LDL throughout their lives show substantially lower rates of heart attack and stroke across entire lifetimes. This cannot be confounded by lifestyle, diet, medication adherence, or any of the factors that complicate observational studies. The genes were assigned before anyone knew what a statin was. and they consistently show that lifelong lower LDL exposure produces lower lifetime cardiovascular risk. On dose response, the benefit tracks proportionally with how much LDL is reduced, regardless of which drug class achieves that reduction. This is one of the strongest indicators of causation in medicine. Now let me address the strongest skeptical arguments honestly, because they deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. The first concerns older adults. Some observational studies, most famously a 2016 systematic review, found that in older populations, higher LDL was not associated with all-cause mortality, and in some datasets appeared inversely associated, meaning higher LDL looked protective. This is cited frequently by LDL skeptics. There is something genuine here. Observational data in older populations is genuinely complicated by reverse causation, the phenomenon where illness causes low LDL rather than low LDL causing illness. People who are frail, malnourished, or chronically unwell often have low LDL because their bodies are failing, not because low LDL made them unwell. When you see low LDL associated with higher mortality in this population, you are often looking at sick people whose illness suppressed their LDL, not healthy people who happen to have low LDL. The observational data also conflates all-cause mortality with cardiovascular mortality. People in their 80s die from pneumonia, cancer, frailty, and falls, causes unrelated to LDL. This dramatically dilutes any cardiovascular signal. The genetic evidence and the randomized trial evidence, neither of which has these confounding problems, continue to show cardiovascular benefit from LDL reduction even in older adults. That is why guidelines continue to support treatment in this age group at elevated cardiovascular risk. The second skeptical argument, half of heart attacks happen in people with normal LDL. This is used to suggest LDL cannot be the primary driver, but this argument misunderstands probabilistic risk. Smoking does not cause every lung cancer. Not every smoker gets lung cancer. Some non-smokers do. A risk factor operating probabilistically across a population will produce events throughout the distribution of that factor. Additionally, normal LDL is defined against population averages in countries where cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death. Average in a diseased population is not optimal for health. And the snapshot LDL at the time of a heart attack does not represent that person's decades of cumulative exposure. The third, particle size. The claim that large, fluffy LDL particles on ketogenic diets are benign while small, dense particles cause disease, and therefore elevated LDL on keto does not matter. There is something partially true here. Small, dense particles may be somewhat more atherogenic per particle. But when you control for total ApoB, total particle count, the additional risk from particle size becomes small or negligible. Particle number is the dominant driver. If your ApoB is significantly elevated on any dietary pattern, that represents elevated risk, regardless of particle size. The particle size argument has become a rationalization for ignoring high particle counts, and that is not what the evidence supports. The fourth, pharmaceutical industry influence. This is a legitimate concern to take seriously. Industry-funded trials can be designed advantageously, negative results are underpublished, and financial conflicts exist. But the LDL story does not rest on one drug company or one drug class. Most statins are now off patent, available as inexpensive generics, with minimal remaining commercial interest for the original developers. PCSK9 inhibitors come from different companies. Ezetimibe is another manufacturer. The genetic evidence comes from independent academic researchers using public data. You would need to believe in a conspiracy spanning multiple drug classes, multiple companies, multiple decades, multiple countries, and the entire field of human genetics to argue this is a fabricated story. That is not a plausible explanation for the consistency of the evidence. The fifth, what about the blue zones? People in longevity hotspots, Okinawa, Sardinia, Ikaria, Nicoya, Loma Linda, do tend to have lower LDL as a general pattern, consistent with their low saturated fat, high fiber dietary patterns. There is no established blue zone where people eat high saturated fat diets. have high LDL, and live to 100 without cardiovascular disease. If high LDL were genuinely harmless, we would expect to find at least one such population. We do not. Where does this leave us practically? Get your ApoB measured if you can. It is a more direct measure of atherogenic particle burden than LDL cholesterol alone. If ApoB is elevated, broadly above 80 to 90 milliliters DL, that is meaningful information, particularly in younger adults where decades of cumulative exposure remain ahead. If a dietary pattern, including ketogenic diets, which do raise LDL significantly in a meaningful subset of people, pushes your ApoB substantially higher, that is a red flag worth taking seriously regardless of how you feel. The metabolic improvements from that diet may be real, but if they come at the cost of meaningfully elevated atherogenic particle burden, you are trading one set of risk factors for another. Focus on the full picture of cardiovascular risk: blood pressure, blood sugar, physical activity, smoking, inflammation, sleep, and stress management. ApoB is the most important single lever for cardiovascular risk reduction we have, but it is not the only one. If your ApoB remains persistently elevated despite genuine lifestyle change, have an honest conversation with your doctor about whether medication is appropriate for your individual risk profile. The evidence that statin therapy reduces cardiovascular events is among the strongest in all of preventive medicine. Side effects are real, but relatively uncommon, and for most people at meaningful cardiovascular risk, the benefit substantially exceeds the risk. The debate about LDL and ApoB is healthy and important. Skepticism of pharmaceutical industry influence in medicine is legitimate and worthwhile. But at some point, the debate must give way to informed action based on the best available evidence. When multiple independent lines of evidence, randomized trials, genetic studies, meta-regression across drug classes, and biological mechanism all converge on the same conclusion, the simplest explanation is that it is real. The evidence on LDL and ApoB is about as strong as evidence gets in medicine. Measure your numbers, understand your individual risk, make decisions based on your actual biology, not on ideology. If this was useful, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone navigating these questions. I will see you in the next video.